You know that guy that you once crossed the street to get away from because he looked a little bit unsavory and suspect? And then when you finally did cross the street, he catcalled you and shouted misogynistic and demeaning things at you? Imagine if that guy was a really hot fairy. Welcome to the Romantasy genre, a popular blend of romance and fantasy that is just toxic, lazy, conservative propaganda. Except for the good stuff. And there is some good stuff. And the good stuff is queer. Because of course it's queer. And just to let you know that I'm queer, I'm drinking a nice latte. Okay, fine. I'm joking. Except I'm not joking. So let's talk about it. I have talked a lot on this channel about romantic fantasy because it's a genre that really intrigues me. It is the most popular genre of fiction in the world right now. And that comes with a lot of good and a lot of bad. I do not inherently hate romantasy, but I do genuinely believe that most of it is toxic, lazy, conservative propaganda. And of course, it doesn't have to be. And of course, not all of it is. But just for anyone who doesn't know, what exactly is romantasy? Well, to put it as simply as I can in a single sentence, romantic fantasy stories are stories set in a fantasy world where the romance between two characters is the focal point of the tale. Seems pretty simple, right? So why is it so toxic and lazy? And why am I calling it conservative propaganda? That seems a little bit extreme. Luckily, I have proof. Now, before anyone jumps down my throat and before I really tear this entire genre to pieces, I do need to state very clearly and honestly that I understand why romantasy is so popular and why so many people love it. If you are alive and awake right now, you're probably aware that the world is pretty dismal. Things are not going well for most people. I know. I'm a trans woman living in the UK. I'm very aware of that. And one of the many purposes of every kind of art form is escapism. To distract us from the world that we live in and present us with something fun and exciting and beautiful and interesting for us to lose ourselves in and forget our lives, forget our reality, at least for a little while. That's what video games are for. It's what action movies are for. It's what fantasy stories are for. A few months ago, I went through a really stressful and difficult time, and I gave up reading the usual genres that I turn to every day, and instead I was reading lots of fantasy fiction, including romantic fantasy, because it was a distraction, because it was escapism, because it made me feel happy and comfortable and safe, but also intrigued and emotionally stimulated. But the big problem for me, and something that genuinely confuses me no matter how much romantasy I read, and I've read quite a few at this point, is what exactly defines escapism when it comes to romantasy. Because one of the key escapist elements of fantasy fiction is providing you with a living and breathing world that is different from your own world, and yet something that you can recognize and attach yourself to and place yourself in and feel it and see it and breathe it in. But most romantasy books are guilty of having terrible world building. I do not believe the worlds that I see in romantasy fiction. I've said before that it feels more like you're standing on a stage with a two-dimensional backdrop and cardboard cutouts of characters. Good fantasy fiction creates a world that is so vivid you genuinely believe it could exist. That if you stepped into it, it would be so well realized that the food and the politics, the history, the fashion, the social behavior of the people, it would all be fully realized, fully considered, and fully functioning. That is never the case with bad romantasy fiction, and most of it is bad. The fantasy part of romantasy barely exists. These worlds are just two-dimensional backdrops for toxic relationships to flourish. Romantasy is generally not good fantasy. But I do have two examples that are. Feybound by Sara El Arifi is on the surface pretty similar to A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, except that El Arifi has created a fantasy world first and foremost. I fully understand the war, the politics, the geography, the history of this place. It's very well established, I understand the mechanics of it, and I can imagine it as a real world. So then I set foot in it and I start to follow the romance as it plays out. Good fantasy. Thus, pretty decent romantasy. And we also have The Hurricane Wars by Thea Guanzon, a book about political military intrigue that is also a tropey romantasy book, an enemies to lovers story about an arranged marriage. But the author has fully coloured in the world that you then step into. You understand how it all works. The edges of the map have been filled in. The characters are three-dimensional. Everything about this world feels tangibly real. So therefore, the stakes actually matter. And they feel bigger than just the romance. This is, to put it bluntly, a real novel. Romantasy books don't feel like real novels. The characters are not fleshed out in any way, and the world barely exists at all. The world is just a rough sketch, a flimsy backdrop that falls apart as soon as you touch it. So there is good romantasy out there in the sense that there is romantasy that actually has its fantasy element well and truly established and explored by authors who recognize that it is their job to create a fantasy world that functions and feels like a real place. And doesn't that help with the escapism? I find it hard to understand how romantasy can be so escapist when so much of it has nowhere for you to escape to. Where are you going? Where is this world? How am I supposed to actually feel like I'm lost in it and distracted from my real world when I have no idea how this world functions at all? So when people tell me that romantasy is escapist, I struggle to believe them for two reasons. One, everything I just said. The fantasy element is not there. Therefore, the world is not somewhere you can actually escape into. And the other reason, the big reason, the reason that we're here is the fact that the romance also isn't escapist. Let's take a look at some examples. This book here, with budget Will Poulter sitting ominously over my shoulder, is Quicksilver by Callie Hart. A book that gaslights you into thinking that just for a minute it might be a good novel. Now, I've made a video explaining all of this in detail, but I felt very betrayed by this book. See, for the first 100 pages of this novel, we are presented with a world that we can relatively understand and imagine is real. Thus, the escapism feels like a thing. And the best thing about the first 100 pages is the protagonist herself. She is presented as a kind of Aladdin figure, or maybe even like a Robin Hood type. She is a roguish teenage girl from the slums. She steals things and runs away from the cops. She defends her people, her family, her district. She's cheeky and daring. She throws out Spider-Man-style quips at the city guards. She gives a nod and a wink and a smile to the reader. She's a lovable rogue. She is Han Solo as a teenage girl, standing up against injustice. She's so admirable and lovable. And there's nothing cringe about the writing either. The dialogue is fun and energized. She's also a very sexually liberated character. She talks about the people that she's slept with and the mistakes that she's made and how they've gotten her into hot water with local gangs. She's really fun, and I felt proud of her. I was excited to follow her journey. Then you hit page 100. And it feels as though the author basically says, what, you thought that this was going to be an interesting, dynamic, well-written fantasy story? No, my dear. No. This is conservative propaganda. This is a carbon copy of A Court of Thorns and Roses. What? How? Why? Well, around the 100-page mark, our protagonist reaches for a sword because she's in trouble. And as she does so, a puddle of liquid metal and a bunch of shadows drag her into a fairyland. And away she is whisked. And as soon as she arrives, she is hit with so much exposition about how this fairyland works, and the man who dragged her there. A cruel and abusive man, a dangerous man who has done terrible, awful things. A man that she immediately decides to hate and calls him evil. And she learns everything about him from other characters so that we can firmly establish that, yeah, he's evil, and she knows it. She has all the info that she needs. Because it was dropped on her and us like a ton of bricks, because the good writing went out the window. But the problem is that this toxic, awful man, this dangerous, murderous villain, he's really hot. So what is a girl to do, you know? He's really hot. He's He's so hot. You get what I'm saying? See, this is why this is good escapism. Because you've got a toxic, awful man who she knows is dangerous and evil and murderous and not to be trusted. But he's so gosh darn handsome. And it's not like in real life you get handsome men who turn out to be abusive, evil villains. In real life, cishet men are fully good. And that's boring. So we need good escapism, where men are evil and dangerous and just so hot. No, wait, sorry, no. That doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound like escapism at all. In fact, it feels like instead, we are for some reason romanticizing toxic, awful men. And it's not like the vast majority of violence and abuse is perpetrated by cishet men, right? Against women. Right? Where is the escapism in presenting us with a horrible, toxic, dangerous man who demeans our protagonist and removes her agency, who steals her away and traps her against her will, who calls her demeaning nicknames, who threatens her, who erases all the colour from her life, who erases all the personality that we, the reader, found interesting and intriguing and admirable about her? Where is the escapism in presenting us with a man like that who happens to be hot and telling us that this is a romance? That is not escapism. That is the unfortunate lived reality of so many women in the Western world. And this is why I call books like Quicksilver and Fourth Wing and A Court of Thorns and Roses conservative propaganda, because they are presenting you with escapism that is simply a tough young woman falling into a romantic situation with a violent and abusive man. These are books that begin by presenting you with a self-insert character who is a strong young woman. That is always how they begin. A Court of Thorns and Roses, Fourth Wing, Quicksilver, all of these books, they start with a brave, brazen young woman, someone to admire. Then they present you with a horrible, abusive man. And along the way, that man is horrible and toxic and abusive. You know that the protagonist is going to take all of that abuse, is going to sleep with him, and the author will present us with a really unimaginative and uninteresting heteronormative sex scene, and a romance will continue to bloom. This is so incredibly dangerous and toxic, reinforcing the idea that this is what men are like, and that in itself is somehow sexy and a good thing and an interesting, exciting thing, and eventually you will sleep with and fall in love with and marry these toxic, abusive, awful men. It's not escapism, it's real life, and it's a terrible, awful aspect of real life. The fact that too many men are dangerous and abusive and toxic, and I don't see where the escapism is. Quicksilver feels like the worst offender as well, because as I keep saying, for 100 pages, we are convinced to root for a young woman who is proud, who is sexually liberated, who is daring and strong, who defends other people, who is roguish and cheeky and has a really colourful personality, until all of that is stripped away from her and an abusive man literally kidnaps her, takes her somewhere else, demeans her, abuses her, makes her feel small and frightened, and bullies her into a romance with him, and all the while the only thing we hear from her about him is that he's hot. This is conservative tradwife propaganda. All of these books are. Although I have to confess, Fourth Wing is really, really fun in spite of all of that. I have a soft spot for this book, and that is probably my most toxic trait. I found Fourth Wing to be so fun and funny. It is action-packed. It is full of jokes, although I think about half the time, maybe more than that, I was laughing at it rather than with it, because it is terrible, but it's an explosive book. And the toxic romance is so ridiculous that you almost feel like it's supposed to be tongue-in-cheek, even though it isn't. But if you read it like it's tongue-in-cheek, like it's a parody or a satire of the very genre that it exists within, it turns into a really, really fun and hilarious romp. But you know in your heart that you're reading it wrong, This isn't what the author intended, and that is very, very depressing. Fourth Wing is as bad as the rest of them. So we've established that Romantasy books are lazy because they have no good fantasy world building at all. We've also established that they are toxic because they reinforce and encourage abusive relationships with horrible men, and they are conservative propaganda. But what about When the Moon Hatched? Well, as I said in my review of this book a few months ago, When the Moon Hatched is uniquely terrible because this book convinced its readers that it's really poetically well written. And I've never ever read a book as awfully written and pretentiously written as When the Moon Hatched. I didn't finish this book. It's not possible because there's no way to actually track what's going on. There are page-length sentences in this book full of terrible, awful descriptions and every literary technique that you learned in high school, alliteration, sibilance, similes, metaphors, etc., etc. And those metaphors don't make sense. They don't work at all. And you try to read through all of this like you're wading through muck, and you may somehow be convinced that this is beautiful writing. Because on the surface, it seems like she's put a lot of effort into her word choices, into the structure of her sentences, and it all seems kind of seductive and alluring and sensual. But it's not. It's an illusion. It's really, really bad. And when you combine that with the fact that this is, once again, toxic conservative propaganda, you get something like this. I look up in time for a blow of wind to push back the hood of the mysterious male from the hungry hollow. My heart plummets, breath loosens. For the first time since Fallon taught me speech, I am lost for words. He's harshly chiseled, raw, fiercely beautiful. My lungs pull full of his scent, so deep and drugging like smelted stone topped with a ladle of cream. I hold the breath hostage, taking him in, admiring his black hair that falls just past his shoulders. It's half pulled back off his face that is partially shadowed by a few loose strands falling to soften his regard. His piercing eyes, the rich molten colour of fired wood. His brows are thick, the lower half of his face shaded by a dark beard that adds a rugged texture to his already robust appearance. Like he belongs in one of those renowned warrior clans that took root amongst the Baltanic plains millions of phases ago, wielding an axe and a bloodthirsty roar. His gaze rips from mine, bouncing around our surroundings, searching every shadowed dip. I notice the tapered tip of his right ear is punched through with a small black cuff that encases part of the shell but no beads. In this moment where our protagonist meets a dangerous man that she's probably going to fall in love with, I don't know, I didn't finish the book because it's terrible, Sarah A. Parker has very, very specifically carved out a perfect dangerous man who's also hot. She has described him in so much specific detail so as to ensure us that this man is stereotypically, traditionally beautiful. He's got just the right amount of stubble, just the right kind of hair. He's got one earring on his pointy elf ear, so you know he's a bit of a bad boy. This man has been factory produced to be sexy yet dangerous, tall, dark, and handsome. A man who will present such a distraction to a woman who is first presented as dangerous and willful and independent, that she will eventually let go of everything that makes her a strong, independent woman and give in to the whims and the temptations of this dangerous yet sexy man. It's pathetic. They're all pathetic. There is no escapism here. It's all very toxic. And one other thing that annoys me about all of this is the use of males and females as nouns in these books. Fourth Wing didn't do it, as far as I remember, but the books that have fairy people always do. Quicksilver, When the Moon Hatched, A Court of Thorns and Roses, and several others, they make use of males and females as nouns, and I think that this is a very serious point, and I am not being hyperbolic here. I really think this is important, because when we talk about our fellow human beings, and we're talking about gender, we use words like boys, girls, girls, men, and women. I think you probably know that. We refer to males and females when talking specifically about the animal kingdom and often their mating habits in particular. And it's very obvious why these authors do this. It's to make these toxic, dangerous, horrible men seem barbaric and animalistic. They're not men. They're males. They're like wolves or bears. They're hungry. They have sharp teeth. They follow their instincts. They are predators. And that, for some reason, is hot to some straight women. It is removing their humanity in a way that is supposed to be hot, but I think is toxic and dangerous. And there's another reason why the males-females thing is so awful, which is that in the real world, when we're not talking about animals and we're talking about our fellow human beings, there are two groups that say males and females. And those two groups are awful, terrible, dangerous people. Who are they? Incels and TERFs. Incel men will dehumanize women by referring to them as females. And transphobes who use the arguments of gender essentialism as if that's even a real thing to strip the rights away from a vulnerable minority group will say phrases like males and females instead of men and women, attempting to reduce people to their biological elements, thus constraining us to our genders as if they are prisons, taking us back hundreds of years and removing feminism from the very fabric of our society. So it is a very big deal when these books keep referring to men and women as males and females. It creates a strict gender binary. It removes the humanity from these men, thus making them seem like just dangerous and feral predators. And it lumps all of these books in with the ideologies and the language of incels and TERFs. How is any of that defensible? And even as I'm saying this, I still see the argument that there is something fun and exciting and escapist about presenting a dangerous character who is toxic and cruel and making him a love interest. I do see the logic in it. I do see the temptation, the intrigue, the excitement. I do. Even as a queer woman, I see it, I understand it, I sympathize with it. But it is all so compounded by terrible writing, non-existent world building, and toxic conservative propaganda. And when you look at all of these elements and you put them all together, there is nothing that is appealing or defensible about the Romantasy genre. It's not as escapist as people seem to think. It's not attractive. It is entirely toxic. It reinforces horrible gender stereotypes. The writing is generally lazy. The characters are two-dimensional. It encourages heteronormative thinking and asks the reader to make peace with the fact that all men are dangerous, abusive, cruel. They strip away the independence and admirable traits of women. They prey on women, however strong they may be. Where is the good in this? Where is the escapism? And yet I have a voice in my head that says this is just a bit of fun. It's just fun. None of it's real. It's all imaginary. Good women with good boyfriends and husbands, they read these books as fun escapist schlock. And that's okay, Willow. It's fine. It's not a big deal. Just enjoy it for what it is. And I don't disagree with that. It's fine. But I also firmly believe in everything I've just said. The genre as a whole is toxic, lazy, conservative propaganda. We deserve more. We deserve better. There is much better fiction out there, even within the Romantasy genre. Most of it is queer or has queer elements. It's not my fault that queer writers are better than straight writers. I am sick of the fact that toxic, lazy, conservative propaganda is what sells right now. It feels like a very sad and backwards time. The entire world is becoming more conservative at the moment. Life is dangerous for people like me. And on top of that, as a book fan, as a book critic, as a reader, as a writer, as an editor, as a poet, as someone who lives and breathes literature, it is exhausting to see how the most popular fiction in the world right now is toxic, lazy, conservative propaganda. So go read something else, read widely, read diversely, read my book, Managing and Other Lies, support me on Patreon, and subscribe for books.